So thank you for coming, and thank you for missing the ball game. I hope I'll make this worth your while, at least a little bit. So I'm a computer scientist by training, but I work in both the computer science department at Georgetown as well as its law school. So I sort of alternate between teaching and doing research in pure technology and also in sort of public policy and law issues. And election technology is one area that I think combines both of them in an amplified way compared to really almost anything else I've worked on. Elections have become contentious in the United States over a very short period of time. Certainly, when I started working in this area, almost all of the things that we worried about were hypothetical. And they were things that we kind of had to convince people that, you know, elections, the integrity of elections and the integrity of the technology in our elections may be important someday. And I think we ourselves didn't even foresee just how much to the forefront of public discourse election and election technology and very specific details about elections would come. So in order to have a conversation about the integrity of our election technology, we have to start by acknowledging and engaging with two realities that are unsatisfying when we put them together, because they lead us to the question of, well, then what? And the first is that there are, truly are, serious technical vulnerabilities in many parts of US election infrastructure that do have the potential, if exploited, to alter election outcomes in at least some jurisdictions in the country. And that is definitely true. There is no way to run away from that underlying fact here in 2024. That remains true. It's less true than it's been, but it is still true. The second, though, and we can't talk about the first without also acknowledging the second, is that there is no credible evidence. And when I say no, I really truly mean none. No actual credible evidence that any of these vulnerabilities have actually been exploited to alter a US election outcome. There may have been attempts to do that, but there's no evidence that the final election outcome of any US election has ever been compromised by technical attacks. And we tend to focus on one or the other depending on how happy we are with whatever the outcome of whatever election we're talking about. But we just can't have an honest conversation about this without really engaging with both of these things at the same time. But it's quite unsatisfying, because this doesn't tell us much. It leaves this huge gap between what's possible and what's happened, and a large sort of unknown area. So I'm going to show you a photo. When I show this photo to my students in my election integrity course, I feel really old when people don't recognize it. Many of you may recognize this. What is this photo? This is a photo of hanging chads. What state was this taken in? Florida. So you can tell it was Florida, even though he's not dressed for Florida. You don't see a beach outside. But we all recognize this because this photo was on every news show and every newspaper for weeks and weeks in November and December of 2000. And this is a picture of the recount in the Florida election. And this gentleman, who has these incredibly photogenic eyes, had the misfortune of being in front of the cameras and became the face of what was then understood to be everything wrong with Florida. Everything wrong with the election technology in use in Florida. And what I find very interesting is that the meaning of this photo, at least among people who study election technology, has changed by 180 degrees since the time that it was taken. And we now look at this photo and understand it to be a strength of the technology that they were using, because a human being was able to examine these ballots and reach conclusions about what the voter intended to do, the voter that had interacted directly with this piece of cardboard that he's holding up to the light. And that we now understand to be a tremendously important property of election technology that they actually had, and in some cases we lost since then. So the 2000 election, what was this technology? If you go back to any of the news reporting, everybody in the country had words like hanging chads and pregnant chad and so on. This basically was a device that a voter would vote on by punching out a little hole, actually a little rectangle, in a perforated card that would be fed into a IBM type card tabulator, a computer punch card tabulator. The technology itself dates from the 1950s. It was, remained in use well after the manufacturer had stopped supporting it. The device that you vote on is a voting machine, but the only electricity is the light bulb in the voting booth, so that you can see it. It's an entirely mechanical device. You insert the card in the top, and then you punch with this little stylus a hole through the position associated with the candidate that you are choosing, and you find out what position that is with this overlay booklet that's placed on top of a template with positions that you punch out. You take that card out of the voting machine, and what you get is this generic ballot card. It doesn't actually have the names of the candidates on it, with holes punched out in the various races that you voted in. But the holes are just numbered positions. This technology had been in use for about 40 years in Florida and Wisconsin and a couple of other states that used them. But the 2000 election was interesting. It was highly contested. It was 50-50, really. We had no idea who the ultimate winner would be. The country was heavily, heavily divided, very much in the way it has been in the recent elections in this decade. But this resulted in huge voter turnout in unprecedented ways. And more people showed up to vote in some precincts in Florida, particularly in Miami-Dade County, than ever before. And a bug in this machine, in this voting machine, manifested itself kind of for the first time because of the number of people who voted. And that bug was very simple. Those little rectangles of cardboard have to go somewhere after you punch them out. Where do they go? Well, they go right behind the position where you voted. And what that means is that if a lot of people show up to vote, the more popular a candidate is, the more little pieces of rectangular cardboard back up in the machine behind the position associated with that candidate. And it becomes physically harder to actually punch the rectangle out as the day goes on. This hadn't happened very often, that enough people showed up that was an issue, but in the 2000 election in Miami-Dade County, they discovered a weird anomaly, that a surprisingly large number of people voted for everyone but president in this highly contested election. They just left the president blank. They voted for dog catcher and a member of Congress and local assembly office. And the reason was that they hadn't been successful in fully punching out the little rectangles. Now, sometimes you would see a little indentation where that was attempted to be punched out, or it would make a little flap that would close up, preventing the card reader from being able to read it. And so we had the recount with this poor gentleman examining the ballots, one from each party, to try to reach a consensus about what the ballots meant. Now, this photo was, I counted as one of the top 10 important photos of the last 100 years in terms of influence on US public policy. It's right up there with the moon landing or the Kent State photo, or pick important photographs that have sort of changed how we think about politics or public policy or the world around us. This photo resulted in a divided country being unified about one thing. This is bad. We have to get rid of this old technology. And Congress very quickly passed an overwhelmingly bipartisan piece of legislation in this incredibly divided country called the Help America Vote Act of 2002. Its main effect was to basically provide a very large amount of funding for new voting equipment that states could use this money to purchase, and essentially outlawed this old punch card technology because it's, and the sort of mechanism for this was voting equipment needed to be accessible to the disabled, a totally laudable goal, and providing funding to actually get new voting equipment that would meet these requirements. Unfortunately, mostly that equipment didn't exist at the time that it was mandated. And so there was a rush by manufacturers to produce Help America Vote Act compliant voting equipment in time for states to be able to buy it with this giant pile of money. And what happened was pretty much exactly what you would imagine would happen, which is that that equipment may not have been as good as you would like if they had had more time to do it and they weren't rushing to get it in place. So HAVA allowed for two types, broadly speaking, of precinct in-person voting equipment. The first was called precinct-counted optical scan paper ballots. And that's essentially a ballot that you might mark by hand, or you might mark with the aid of a machine that has assistive technology, such as a reader that will read things, or a Braille interface. But in either case, the output of the machine is either a paper ballot that you mark with a pen, or a paper ballot that's been marked with a machine that you can look at and see who the candidates are before you put it into a scanning device called a ballot scanner that does two things. First, it reads the ballot and tallies who's being voted for in each race. And if the ballot is accepted by the machine, it stores it in a box. The second type of machine was one called a DRE, or a direct recording electronic voting machine. And that's a machine in which the voter interacts directly with a computer, a special purpose computer, that displays the ballot and lets them make their selections on a screen, and then records the result internally without any paper being involved in the casting of the vote. And that has the advantage that a computer is very flexible. This assistive technology can be built into it in a very convenient way. They typically will have an audio interface, much like an ATM machine. Sometimes has a little headphone jack in it. Might have Braille surfaces. There are even sip and puff interfaces for the highly mobility impaired. Even if you don't have use of arms and legs, if you can use a straw, you can navigate on the screen with these things. So they're very flexible, and the experience of voting seems extremely modern, right? It seems much more modern than those old punch card systems. And so this was very popular. So here's a typical, and in fact, I checked, it's in use in some counties in Missouri. This is a ballot scanner device, the first type of these machines. It looks sort of like a fax machine, or if you're pessimistic, a paper shredder. You feed in a ballot, and it stores it. It keeps a tally of the votes in an internal memory, and the ballots themselves go into this box below. You can see there's a lock for the box that keeps a copy of the ballots. This is a ES&S model M100 for anybody keeping track. Here's another machine. This is no longer in use in Missouri. It's still in use in a couple of states. This is a DRE machine, a touchscreen computer. You can see it looks a little more modern, although it actually has duct tape involved in it. And, so that's how hurriedly they got them out. If you look very closely, you can see there's some braille on these buttons on the bottom, so you can navigate them without, even if you can't see the screen. But the ballot selections are displayed on the screen. You touch the screen to indicate who you want to vote for. You can go from one screen to the next, and then push the vote button, and your votes are recorded internally. So when this technology was rolled out over a period of only a few years throughout pretty much the entire country, replaced all its voting equipment, questions got raised about whether this new technology was trustworthy. And in fact, there are two problems that these machines started to surface. And the first problem is the technical problem, which is, can we make technology that deals with our most important civic function, choosing our leaders, can we make it sufficiently secure and trustworthy that we can use it for this purpose? This is almost catnip for people like me, for computer scientists, for technologists, because these problems are really hard and really interesting. And in fact, we've made significant progress since the time the Help America Vote Act was passed in figuring out how to do that. We know how to do it in ways that are much more principled and much more theoretically sound than we did back in 2002. And it's unfortunate that we didn't know then what we know now, because there's still a lot of sort of bad voting equipment out there. But progress is being made on that. And the second problem, though, is not the technical problem. It's the problem of increasing confidence in election outcomes by voters in the presence of technology that may not be that reliable and certainly isn't that well understood by members of the public, by the electorate. And in fact, making progress on the first and talking about the first problem may have actually exacerbated the second problem. We may actually, by talking about, well, here are the weaknesses, here's how we have to improve these systems, we may be giving fodder to conspiracy theorists who want to cast doubt on election outcomes because of what's possible rather than what's already happened. So we have a dilemma that by solving the first problem, which requires talking about it first and foremost, we may actually be reducing confidence in elections by improving them. Or at least that's the thing everyone working in this space worries about. So I'm going to start with the optimistic technology view, which, by the way, I will also end with. But in the middle, we may go off a little bit, with the technical problem. I'm going to start with the question of how do we actually, in fact, make this, these systems better. And so I'm going to reduce this to a simple statement of the problem. Is the outcome of the election that's being reported correct? Is the winner actually the person who was voted for? Were the votes recorded correctly, and were they counted correctly? And I'm going to declare victory if we can just solve this problem, even though in fact there are a whole bunch of other problems around it. But I'm going to ask the question of, can we solve just this with the technology we've got? And the first observation I want to make is that this problem sounds pretty simple. It's counting, which is the thing computers are very good at. This is sort of the first task that technology can do. But in fact, this is really hard. The first reason that it's really hard is that US elections are the most complex by many measures in the world. There's no other country that votes on as many things as we do. and with as many different ballots. And in some states, Missouri is actually one of the states in which we vote on fewer things than some other states. In some states, the ballot is multiple pages long. It's sort of like taking the SAT. And complex systems, and particularly complex systems involving software, of the kind required to manage something as complicated as the US election, is something that we actually don't know how to build reliably in a provable and principled way. Our computer science is the branch of engineering that is sort of embarrassing. We build things and they don't work, and then we have this whole term of debugging as a normal part of the process. People who build bridges don't debug their bridge just stays up. Computers don't. Now I want to assure you that's not because computer scientists are just people who couldn't handle other branches of engineering. It's actually because there are fundamentally difficult problems with understanding software-based systems. The second reason this is hard is that elections themselves have to be perfect, or at least they have to report the correct outcome before it's certified. There is no mechanism, particularly in a federal election, for a do-over. If you discover that your election, something went wrong with your election, that the result is invalid, you're not going to have time to rerun a new election. And what that means is that merely detecting anomalies and merely detecting irregularities isn't good enough. We have to actually prevent them or recover from them before they're finalized. Then we have the problem that unlike almost any kind of transaction system that we use for other things, banking and so on, there's no trusted third party that we can rely on to do things for us. We have to do this ourselves. We have to take a bunch of people who don't trust each other, which is why we're holding an election in the first place, and they have to get together and figure out what the truth is about what people want. And we can't just have somebody neutral do this, because there is no neutral party in the country. We're all entitled to have an opinion about who should win. We're all interested in the outcome. And then finally, we have maybe the worst one of all, or the most difficult one at all. We have a requirement, for very good reasons, for a secret ballot. It shouldn't be possible for anybody, even with your cooperation, to find out who you voted for. And that's done to prevent coercion and buying of votes and all sorts of things that there is a long history of people trying to do, intimidate voters into voting a certain way or buying their votes. So we have a pretty hard requirement, pretty set in stone requirement, that ballots have to be secret. It should not be possible for anybody to find out who you actually voted for. You can ask you can tell them, you can lie, and there shouldn't be any way of confirming whether you're telling the truth. And that's baked into the system. But what it means is that if we're not sure about how the election went, we can't ask the voters who they voted for, because there is no way to match a ballot with an individual by the time it's reached the tallying system by design. Now, we are adding computers into the mix. So ballots are, in general, in almost every place in the United States, the exception being a couple of places, very small towns in New England that have a small number of voters, where they do it entirely by hand. But ballots are generally tallied by software, by systems, by computer systems that are controlled by software. Now, in DRE voting machines, those touchscreen voting machines that I talked about, not only are the ballots tallied by software, the ballots are also cast by computer and under the control of software. So the display of the ballot is controlled by software. The entry of the input, the processing of your input, where on the screen you're touching, is under the control of software. How it shows you who it thinks you voted for is under the control of software, and the storage of the vote is controlled by software and on a memory card that's inside the voting computer. And unfortunately, software is inherently unreliable for reasons that I encourage you to all go and get a degree in computer science. And we tell you this at the end because it's sort of complicated, that there are some fundamental reasons why this is always going to be something that we can't tell whether the software we've built is actually the software that meets our specification. We can get close. There are things we can do to make it more reliable, but we can never be sure that it's 100% reliable. Now, in a world like that, let me pose two questions that were entirely hypothetical questions at the time that we posed them, because we were just trying to convince people to care about this, which is, if you lost an election that was under control of software, what might you say if you weren't happy with losing? Right? Well, I think you might say, the software made a mistake, or the software was maliciously tampered with, and that cost me the election. And the flip side of that is, if you had to defend an election that was under the control of software, how might you do it? And ultimately, you might not have a great story to refute the claim that the software made an error or was maliciously tampered with. So that's, that means having elections depend on the reliability of software for the integrity of the election is a bad idea. But we have a dilemma. And the dilemma is that because of the complexity of US elections, automation has become essentially essential. Automation is done with computers today for almost all of these. That's really the only way to do this. But automation has touched pretty much every facet of modern US elections. This is, by the way, the pessimistic part. We will get back to optimism. Automation's untrustworthy for fundamental reasons. And this has two classes of potential impact on elections. For some aspects of elections, like voter registration and logistics and the public reporting of the results, a failure in the software or flaws in those systems can cause chaos, it can cause doubt, but we can probably recover from them. It would be certainly bad if the list of registered voters isn't available on election day, but we can at least print it out and go to a paper copy of it. If the initial unofficial results are wrong, we can correct that later. It's unfortunate, it will cause all sorts of doubt, it could make propaganda worse, but it's recoverable. However, there's a worse problem, which is that certain types of vote casting and vote recording systems, in particular DRE machines, those flaws go from being unfortunate to being fatal. They can result in us not knowing who should have won the election with no way to find out. If the software isn't recording the votes correctly or displaying the correct ballot or altering the internal memory, there is no ground truth that we can look at with those systems to find out who won. Now, recent work by computer scientists has shown that there is some HAVA-compliant voting technology, in particular the optical scan paper ballot systems, in which we can take advantage of automation, but get confidence that the election outcome is correct by doing some clever statistical sampling of the ballots and comparing them with the way the machine recorded them. But that's only possible with some of the technology that HAVA basically forced every state to switch to after 2002 because of that photo of the man with the punch card. Now, I probably don't have to tell you, but I will point this out because it happened 2 miles from my house. The stakes are high. You probably recognize this is the US Capitol, and in front of the US Capitol is a riot, which ended up going inside the US Capitol. Everybody here, about 2,000 people by many estimates, everybody here was absolutely convinced that the election was stolen with technology, right? The stakes of having trustworthy elections are we don't have a peaceful transfer of power if enough people are not convinced of the outcome. And we've now seen that happen, not just, it's not something that we talk about as a historical thing. This is a thing that happened a few years ago in the last presidential election, and people died. And it was questionable whether the election would be able to be certified, at least on the day that it was supposed to be certified. Okay, so let's look at this technical problem. And let's understand what we need to do what we need to be robust against in order to build a reliable election system. And one of the first things we start with in computer security is to try to understand, well, what are our threats? What is the landscape in which this is operating? What are the things that we have to defend against? And I really divide this into 4 categories. Only the first 3 were things we had been thinking about traditionally. The first is random, nature, natural disasters, mishaps, mistakes that people make, both human and software. The things that just by bad luck, we tested them, they didn't work properly, or nature wipes out polling places or what have you. But no malice is involved. The second is the insider threat. This is one that's often we're worried about because it's really a hard one to deal with. Corrupt election officials who are, say, trying to sell offices. This usually, when this happens, it hasn't happened recently, but when it does happen, it's almost always for local offices. You can get pay a certain amount of money and you can get elected dog catcher, and so on. It's very rare that it's national office. Historically that happens with. But it's a very prominent threat because these are the people running the elections, and they may not, there's no guarantee that they're going to be trustworthy inherently. They are in practice, but there's nothing inherently guaranteeing that. And the second is potentially sophisticated, moderately sophisticated outsiders. The most prominent example would be a corrupt candidate or supporters of a corrupt candidate that want to stuff ballot boxes or do whatever it is they want to do to cheat in the election to give them some sort of advantage by exploiting some flaws in the technology. And for really the first 240 or so years of the United States, those were the 3 things that we worried about. Those are the things that we designed election systems and election technology to resist. But in fact, in 2016, we saw that there is a 4th class of potential adversary for elections that we have to defend against, which is the highly sophisticated adversary, a foreign state actor. Another powerful government with an intelligence apparatus that wants to basically let loose its military and intelligence capability aimed at attacking voting systems that are run not by the Defense Department, not by the federal government, but by the thousands of individual counties that manage elections throughout the United States. We don't ask the county sheriff to repel foreign military invasions, but it turns out we do ask the local county to repel cyber attacks from hostile foreign powers. And we've seen in 2016 that actually can be an issue. All right, so technology is unreliable, and the threat landscape is severe. What do we do? And there are really 2 approaches if you've got unreliable technology that you want to use to solve an important problem. And the first approach, and it's the approach that we were all trying until we invented a second approach about just over 10 years ago, about a dozen years ago. The first approach is to try to eliminate all the defects in the technology. Make it as good as we can. Look for flaws and fix the flaws. And that's kind of the best we have with software. with software-based systems. So unfortunately, we don't know how to fully reliably do this. We never know when we found the last bug in a technology. But this was the only approach that we had for building secure election systems. And so what all the experts in the field were focused on was scrutinizing the equipment and trying to find things wrong that could be exploited and reporting them and getting them fixed. But we never know when we're done. We never know that some more clever person who isn't going to report the problem didn't find something that we missed. But more recently, we've switched approaches. We've started to acknowledge the futility of making the technology perfect and switched to an approach of building systems that have an architecture that allows us to have reliable elections with unreliable components, tolerate the inevitable flaws in the technology. And there were two breakthroughs, and there are a lot of people who deserve a lot of credit here, but I'm going to just single out two. The first is Ron Rivest, who's a computer scientist at MIT, who came up with the requirement that and the formal statement of the requirement called software independence, that an election should be, the integrity of an election should not depend on the integrity of software. If you have an undetected flaw in the software, that should not result in an undetected flaw in the outcome of the election. And that further, you should be able to correct for any flaw without having to rerun the election. You should be able to find that out. So he stated this very beautiful requirement for how you could use technology. It needs to have this property called software independence. Unfortunately, Ron Rivest is a theoretician, and he stopped there. He didn't actually tell us how to do it. But he laid the framework for it. He basically led us almost all the way there. And a fellow by the name of Philip Stark, the following year, a statistician at the University of California, Berkeley, basically said, oh, I know how to do this with optical scan paper ballot machines. We can do this with statistical sampling using pretty much the same foundation that we use to do things like drug trials and testing high reliability components in things. We sample some of the ballots by hand, and we know those ballots are true because the voter marked them. The voter directly interacted with them, so we have ground truth with the optical scan machines, and compare the machine interpretation of a ballot selected at random with the human interpretation of that ballot. And as you look at more of these randomly selected ballots, you gain confidence in the machine interpretation of the ballots that you didn't sample. And it turns out that a surprisingly small number of samples are sufficient, if the technology was working properly, to give you very good confidence. You don't have to do anything even near a full count of all of the ballots. You can sample only a few percent, and you can get sort of arbitrarily high confidence in the outcome. Now, unfortunately, this isn't possible with DRE machines. And the reason is that DRE machines don't have a reliable artifact of the voters' choices. They don't have that paper ballot you can look at, because the same software that you're trying to audit is in control of absolutely everything that you're seeing. And so a flaw in the software, or worse, a malicious change to the software, is something that you can never detect after the fact. So there was good news and bad news, right? The good news is we have a way of conducting highly robust, high-integrity elections using equipment that exists, that's flawed, that we know is flawed, and that might even be malicious in the way it behaves. And we have a procedure that is pretty much guaranteed to a statistical certainty to detect and correct for that using this auditing technique called risk-limiting audits that Philip Stark invented. The bad news is that this only works with some of the voting technology that was in existence at the time. Now, so this is a combination of good news and bad news. And so how good is this news depends on how many of these old machines are still in use. And the answer to that is not that many. They're disappearing. They're still certified for use in Missouri, but fewer and fewer counties are using them. How many people have voted on a DRE machine? A few. How many of you have voted on an optical scan paper machine? More of you. That fraction is shifting in favor of optical scan, and that's true around the country. Missouri is actually one of only a small number of states in which these are still in use at all. There's a lot of reason for optimism. So the first thing is we've got to get rid of the DRE machines and switch to these optical scan machines that give you a reliable paper ballot that can be audited meaningfully. But the second is we have to actually do the audits. And there, the news isn't quite as good. Only a few states routinely do risk-limiting audits today. That number is increasing. Every election, there's more adoption of it. But it takes time to change election procedures and alter election law. Currently, only Colorado actually requires it in every race as part of its election law. But other states are doing them anyway, experimenting with them anyway. But we're still not to the point where this is a universally expected thing. So we have the right equipment, but we're not always using it in a way that lets us take advantage of its great feature that we can still have reliable elections. So I'm just starting to run low on time. The main takeaways from this, if you get nothing out of this, or you were listening to the baseball game surreptitiously while I was talking, just pay attention to this and you got everything. There are real vulnerabilities in US election infrastructure. We've been very fortunate that they don't seem to have been exploited. So that's lucky. The threat is worse than it traditionally has been. It clearly includes foreign state actors that are very sophisticated. And there is reason, that said, for optimism. We have technology, we have techniques to do things that let us have reliable elections in spite of these flaws. And it's not actually that much work to do them, but we need to push to get them implemented everywhere. We need to election officials are inclined toward wanting to make their systems better, but they need funding to do it. They need the political capital to do it, and we can help with that. There's a lot of work to do. In fact, there's enough work to do for everyone here to contribute, whether you're a technologist or not. In particular, the thing the piece of advice that I give, how can I help make elections better? How can I help improve confidence in them and also make them more trustworthy? The single thing that I think you should do, that everybody should do, and you should feel great about yourself if you do it, is become a poll worker. Elections use a huge temporary workforce on election day. The people at the polls are not full-time government employees. They're recruited to work for the day everywhere. Everywhere in the country, they need people to do this. They have a lot of trouble recruiting enough poll workers to do this. So you're performing a valuable public service in making the election happen by doing that. But that's actually not why I'm suggesting that you spend a very long day working for peanuts at the polls. The reason is you then learn firsthand how elections work in your county. And you become a reliable source to your neighbors that can combat disinformation about flaws in the election, or can confirm that, yeah, that's actually a legitimate concern, because you were there. You actually saw it being done. And when your neighbor says, no, there were Venezuelan satellites that were being used to flip votes, you can say, no, actually, I worked at the polls. I actually helped you vote, if you don't remember. And actually, that isn't the way it works. And you telling them that because you've seen it has much more credibility than someone like me who studies this as an academic and works in that suspect city between Maryland and Virginia. So if you becoming a poll worker has this great value, both for the civic duty that you're helping with, but also because you become a trustworthy source of information to people right on the ground. So we have some time for questions, and thank you very much for staying for the whole thing. So I believe Eric will have the microphone.
All right, raise your hand if you have a question. Oh, I was going to give you a warning. The lights are going to come on, but raise your hand. We got a large live stream audience, so we want to get the audio of your questions. I'll start up front here. Just hold the mic close to your mouth.
How many of the swing states are relying on the DRE machines?
Fortunately, very few. Fortunately, most of the swing states, not all of the swing states, but most of the swing states are using some sort of optical scan paper ballot system. That's not universally true, but it's. So some of the swing states are using ballot marking device machines. Georgia is an example, Pennsylvania is an example, which are a hybrid that isn't really fully understood which category it falls into. So essentially those are machines that you mark with a touchscreen computer. It spits out a piece of paper and you use put that piece of paper in the machine. The problem with those is that people very often don't check to see that the piece of paper reflects what their selections were. And so those have not really been studied well enough yet for us to be able to say that a system that uses them is software independent. But it's certainly better than a pure DRE machine because you have a chance of checking your ballot.
I apologize if this is a dense question.
It isn't, let me assure you.
Dense on my part. When you look at it, I can understand the complexities associated with the peripheral things, registration, qualification, all of those sorts of paper op things. But when you're standing in front of a ballot machine, you really only have two things. Can you mark that ballot, however means, so that it can be recognized? And can this machine basically add a series of ones?
Sure.
They don't add anything but ones.
It sounds so simple, right? I mean, in principle, this is addition, right? Which is the simplest problem we can solve.
Well,
and why is this?
It's only an addition of ones. You
Right.
Don't have threes and
not
fours
even
and sixes.
not even hard, right? So that is a great question, and the short answer to it is that the addition isn't the hard part. It's the overall architecture in which the machine exists. All of these machines are ultimately programmable computers because that's the only way to build a machine that does this these days. It's a general purpose computer that's running some special purpose software. That general purpose computer has an operating system running on it, and that operating system can have a flaw in it and be tampered with. It has peripheral devices that it's communicating with to scan the ballots or to read the positions on the screen. Those can have flaws and be tampered with. So it isn't, the way these things fail is not by failing to add the numbers. It's by doing things like recording the vote for the wrong candidate, or by having some flaw that might allow somebody who has physical access to the machine to replace the good software with bad software. And those are really fundamental problems that exist outside. Those problems didn't start with elections. Those have been with us since the beginning of software. And so that's really why I say this is, making these systems perfect is beyond what we know how to do. Because if you could solve that, you could do a lot more than just make elections better.
A question over here on your left.
Hi. I was wondering about efforts by candidates to change the results by pressuring local officials, intimidation, going all the way to asking state officials. and legislatures
Right.
empowering themselves to change the results.
Right. So, that's sort of, so fortunately, I said, I'm going to simplify this problem to just the technology aspect. So I could just say, that's not my problem. But in fact, it's all of our problem, right? We have to, the fact that we might use the technology in a trustworthy way doesn't mean the system itself is trustworthy. It doesn't mean that, we have to trust the process and the election officials to ultimately behave honestly. And I think the only remedy there is transparency. We need to know what everyone is doing. We need to have accountability for this. We need to have things like the tallies be made public, the auditing process to be a public ceremony that we can watch. It should be televised. And those sorts of things help increase confidence that there isn't that sort of backroom cheating or intimidation or pressure. But it's not something that technology itself can solve. It's something that laws and customs and political pressure have to solve.
The question in the back of the room?
What are your thoughts about ranked voting, which seems like it might be good for democracy, but the extra layer of algorithm might make it harder for people to trust?
Yeah, and I think you just summed it up. So ranked choice voting looks very attractive, particularly, we generally have plurality voting. Whoever gets the most votes wins. And when you have more than two candidates, that means you can have things like spoiler candidates who split votes, and that can lead people to not vote for the candidate they actually prefer. And ranked choice voting addresses those problems. But unfortunately, it adds complexity. It can make it confusing as to how to vote. And there can also be, depending on how the ranked choice votes are weighted, it can lead to perverse outcomes where the winner of the ranked choice candidate isn't actually the consensus winner. And any way you weight the ballots has the risk that can happen under some circumstances. So it's not quite the perfect panacea. The reason that we don't use it is mostly because changing election law is hard and slow.
Hey, my name's Ken Williams. I've been working in the security field for about 40 years. My biggest concern with election and voting systems is that they're generally closed source, closed systems.
Right.
And they rely on security through obscurity. They use software that is proprietary,
Right.
and they use hardware that's proprietary.
That's right.
And we don't even know what hardware they're using. A lot of my research in recent years has been on hardware vulnerabilities, in particular proprietary hardware
Right.
vulnerabilities. And so my confidence in the systems is not very high at all.
Yeah, look, I share your concern. I've done reviews of voting systems for a number of different states. I've looked at the proprietary hardware and software of several vendors. I've gotten insider access, and I will tell you, it does not make me feel better about those systems at all. We discovered just horrific problems in everything that we looked at. I think I would love to see open source software and hardware for this, but it still won't solve our problem. Open source is not a solution to reliability or security. It's really a solution to the software life cycle. And every study of open source has been inconclusive about its reliability and security benefits. So I think the approach of, rather than trying to put all of our effort into improving these systems and making them more intrinsically reliable, is going by the wayside in favor of the audit, tolerate the inevitable flaws approach, which lets you use even a malicious black box as long as you're auditing it in a way that is software independent. So that's the benefit of that, is we can use the crappy stuff that we have and still have reliable elections. I'd like it to be less crappy, but that's a harder problem to solve. Yeah.
All right. You had a question here, and then I'll go over to you.
I go back to the Ed Felton days of standing outside of
unprotected
Yeah,
machines,
he'd
voting
go around.
machines.
I'm amazed he didn't get arrested. Yeah.
My question to you, for several years you have had a link on your website to the National Academies, I think it's the national standards for elections. Why do we not hear more about that?
Okay, let me plug it. First of all, there's a report. If you Google National Academies Securing the Vote, you'll get an excellent document about 100 and some odd pages long, aimed at policymakers, that lays out the landscape of U.S. elections and the security reliability problems associated with them, with recommendations for the future. It was produced it was published in 2017. Everything in it is still true. There's hasn't really been much that's changed since then. And if you want sort of a thorough overview, very readable overview of the elections landscape and how to make it better, I can think of no better single resource. If I hadn't been able to be here, I would have just sent a copy and had somebody read it.
All right, we had a question. Where was it? Up here? You have a question?
Well, sort of. Until recently, I voted in the state of Colorado, where 6 weeks ahead of the election, you get a book. And it has pros and cons for the initiatives and all the bios. And then you get your ballot, and you sit down with the book, and you figure out how you want to vote, and you mark your ballot, and you put it in an envelope, and you sign the security place on the envelope, and you walk to the ballot box in your neighborhood, and you drop it in. And you're filmed while you do that, because there are 24-hour cameras on the ballot box. Then up to 48 hours after I've dropped my ballot in, I get an email from the election people, and it says, "Lucky you, your ballot has been not only accepted," I'm a registered voter, "but counted. It went correctly through the digital machine." It then goes to a computer to be counted with everybody else. Colorado used to tell you those computers were not attached to the internet in any way.
Right.
And so they were hack-proof. Is that true?
Well, half of that is true. First of all, Colorado is a state that has put a lot of effort into doing this well. They've taken a lot of advice from experts. Colorado's a model for how to do this. Those tallying computers in the back office, they're essentially large versions of the optical scan machine that I showed. I didn't bring a picture of one with me, but it's just like that, but bigger and more dangerous. They're not connected to the internet, but they're still running software. There's still things that, if you can touch it, you could replace the software with malicious software if you can get hold of it, if you can break into an office or the warehouse where they're stored the rest of the year, because elections aren't running 365 days a year. Those machines are not necessarily being watched as carefully outside of the election as during the election. Or if you had some malicious insider, it's possible for those machines to be tampered with, not over the internet. That's right. So we have a local election official who violated the rules, got caught, and is 9 years, I think. Yeah. So don't do that. But if someone does do that, there are mechanisms not just to catch them, but more importantly, Colorado also does risk limiting audits. So if those machines turn out to have been tampered with and we didn't catch the person in the act, we'll still be able to run reliable elections using that flawed equipment.
All right, Professor Blaze, I'll come up on stage with you. Kind of the final question. Are you looking forward to Wednesday, November 6th? Or does that when your work starts?
I am looking forward to spending the entire month of November in bed after the 6th. So thanks so much.
Well, yeah, thank you. Thank you for a wonderful talk, and thank you all for attending tonight's lecture. Go to lindahall.org for information on all of our upcoming programs, including the opening of our new exhibition, Life Beyond Earth. It opens October
thanks for having me.
25th. Thank you, and have a great rest of your evening.